Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Election Podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer. I am back in Tel Aviv and feeling lucky to be here after I landed from my visit abroad into total chaos at Ben Gurion Airport, the country's only international airport, in what turned into also an embarrassing political moment for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, because after all, what good is an authoritarian-leaning government if it can't make the trains run on time or the airplanes take off and land on time? I'm happy to be back here and to join in person my panel for the week, our crack columnists, Dr. Dalia Shenlin and Esther Solomon. Ladies, welcome. I hope your summer vacation travels go more smoothly than mine did.
Thank you.
All 4 days of them.
Thank you both for being here. Starting with the polls as usual. The Haaretz election tracker has Gadi Eisenkot's Yashar party holding its lead against Netanyahu's Likud party, 24.3 to 22.7 to be exact. That gap has remained static through the past 2 weeks, making us wonder if maybe Eisenkot has begun to hit his ceiling. I'm looking at Dalia because she has taught me to look at trends and not just exactly the snapshot of where we are at the moment. It feels to me like the picture of the pro and anti-Netanyahu blocks and whether or not one or the other is going to form a coalition is getting more cloudy because we have these smaller parties entering the race that are not committing to join a coalition with Netanyahu or without Netanyahu. So, Dalia, as the reigning poll expert, you published an amazing piece, A Total Guide to How to Read the Polls. Do you concur that the picture is getting much more foggy with the entrance of these parties that may or may not reach the electoral threshold, but even if they don't, they may eat some crucial votes from one side or the other?
Absolutely. I think one of the bottom line points that I made in that column was that you don't necessarily only need to know about polls, because when it comes down to it, public opinion is one thing that goes into elections. But in terms of who's going to be forming the next government, we're looking at, 6 or 7 or 8 male party leaders who are going to make those decisions, like a little gang of men. And they are not representative of the general public. And no poll can tell you what's going on inside their heads about their coalition calculations, their bargaining, their ambition, their ego, which kind of ministerial position they're willing to take in order to be bought into some coalition, which is frankly how it works. And so we'd like to think that the voters make the decision, and they will make the decision about the makeup of the Knesset. But unless it's a very decisive win for one bloc or the other, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's quite interesting because all of these little parties, they keep dropping little hints about which side they might or might not support, or whether they're going to try to break through the blocks or boycott this side or that side. I think we're all shooting in the dark. Every week, there's a new headline about the newest game changer. And our colleagues in the Hebrew Haaretz talked about Ofer Winter as a new game changer because he might join a party or start his own party. Most of our listeners probably haven't heard of him. I don't know how many Israelis actually really follow him. I mean,
well, another new entrant just today was Jonathan Pollard.
Of course. Our listeners have definitely heard of. Exactly. Yeah. So it becomes a bit of a parade of personalities. Everybody's trying to guess who's going to be the unexpected one that maybe does something. But the reality is that all of these new little parties are individuals who are placing their ego above the political outcome because they can't possibly join an existing party. They have to try to start their own. Very unlikely they're going to get to 3.25%. Maybe one or two of them will, maybe. And maybe that's a sorry reflection on the kind of political culture in Israel right now.
Are they following a true dream of becoming prime minister, or is this just an ego play, or why do they do it?
I really cannot give you the inside psychology of any one person who's starting a party that's probably never going to get anywhere. We have everybody from Ayelet Shaked, who may be jumping around and maybe joining a party, Sharon Haskel, who left the government, being such a bold whistleblower as to leave the government 10 minutes before elections over the Haredi issue and start her own party.
After she left the last government to join this government.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different jumping arounds. The list just goes on. All the other Likud defectors, Gilad Erdan, we don't know. So I can't tell you what's going on in their personal. It's like, let's not forget Einat Vilf. She has her own party as well, the Oz party, which seems to be little more than pop-up ads on my Facebook page. But these people seem to think, I guess they're surrounded by a little cluster of their friends and allies who say, you're great, we need someone like you. And so they mistakenly have not read the polls, or they have not read my analysis, which is that your friends and your family and your immediate circles, no matter how big they are, they are not representative of the general public, and they're probably not even representing 3.25% of voters.
Yeah, they're not a good data point. Your mom's opinion of you never is, really. Esther, you win the Predictor of the Year award.
Well, that's a big
Predictor
award.
of the Election Season award, because when we were discussing ahead of the Likud primaries whether or not Netanyahu was losing control, because it seemed that perhaps in the primaries there was going to be rising up of some of the candidates he was not fond of, that they were personally popular and they were going to get in the top of his list. But he seems to, I think, successfully have taken control. And you said that. You said he's got it under his hand. He's focusing on it. And what did you think of the results of the primaries?
Well, I think that it definitely shows that the people that are the most pliable and sycophantic to Netanyahu certainly won pretty high. And in any case, Netanyahu still holds the list in his hands. This is not even the final list. He has no real interest in, certainly no investment in internal democracy in his own party. He still has at least 6 or 7 places that he can parachute people into.
But besides yes men who will do whatever Netanyahu says, I mean, some of the figures who he pushed down are yes men and are doing what he says. He just doesn't like their public profile, that they're very outspoken and embarrassing and say things that get foreign governments very angry on a regular basis. What kind of people do you think he's going to be trying to put at the top of his list that he can point to voters and say, okay, vote for my party, stay with Likud, don't go to Gilad Erdan? What kind of a picture is he trying to create?
Well, I mean, the talk was before the Likud primaries is that he wanted more normal people. He wants some semblance of normality in his own party, which is not hard to see that it has lost, certainly over the last few years. That may mean that he pulls in semi-celebs or real celebs from outside of politics that will kind of give a bit of stardust and a bit of popular oomph to his list. It might be some more kind of solid security people rather than the crazy demagogues that he has who talk about security all the time and are making policy in the government. You know, the world's his oyster, basically, on the right-hand side of the spectrum.
Dalia, why the focus on the primaries? Was this just a test of Bibi's control, like as I saw it? And why were we talking about the Likud primaries for 2 weeks in Israel?
I mean, personally, I think that there was a bit of overkill. You know, it is important, right? It is still among the biggest parties in polls. There is still some chance that it will be forming the next government. Not maybe it's not the biggest chance right now, but we haven't seen the final word. And so obviously it's important and it's interesting. And we want to know if the Likud is somehow recognizing, you know, that there's some danger to have gone into a completely radical, ultra-nationalist, populist, practically conspiratorial party over the years under Netanyahu, or whether it would try to take a step towards anything like its roots. Now, we know the answer to that. I personally think it was overkill because there were other major stories going on last week, and really throughout the biggest part of last week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, up until the airport, this was the only thing like taking over all newspaper and television and radio coverage. And I think it came at the expense of other major developing stories, geopolitical stuff, Middle East stuff. Even, you know, the attacks in Syria were sort of there, but took second place, it seems, to these much more, you know, domestic and rather, you know, small. I mean, small in the sense of, you know, we're talking about tectonic shifts around here. I mean, the fact that Jared Kushner came to visit and there was a meeting with him and the leader of the Board of Peace, Nikolai Mladenov, with Netanyahu, not with an underling, to discuss the future of the entire ceasefire plan with Gaza, which actually I think ended in kind of a win for Netanyahu, but it's still got almost no coverage because I just think it's more comfortable for everybody to get into the insider baseball and the play-by-play. And in fact, in a way, it's sort of comforting to be able to play the sport of elections instead of dealing with the issues that are much harder, much more depressing. Probably overall, just touching the issue of Gaza is never going to be that great for Netanyahu. And so maybe that's why he didn't want it as much on the agenda. But I think that there is a bit of escapism going on here, personally. I also think one more point is interesting about this. The Likud has been talking for a long time about these primaries, and they like to take great pride in holding primaries because not every party does. However, more and more parties do. And the Likud has been going on about how we're such a democratic party. And that was a message that came out this week again. What a wonderful celebration of democracy, even though turnout was low. Netanyahu has, like 7 of these reserve slots.
And if he had had his way, they wouldn't have happened.
Right. And they wouldn't have happened at all. And, it's just kind of reiterates what a fiction the whole idea is of just pulling out these slogans that are meaningless when this is the party that is actively doing more than anybody else, more openly than ever, to undermine, to destroy Israel's democratic institutions, such as they are. And yet, here they are, boasting about democracy and getting a huge amount of coverage for it, including from mainstream media, which sometimes thinks of itself as critical of Netanyahu. So I think there's a lot of hypocrisy going on in pretty much every direction here.
Okay, but a cynic, and not even that cynic, would say that this is exactly Netanyahu's genius, that he manages to set the news agenda constantly in Israel all the time. He certainly wasn't really interested in going too deep into his meeting with Kushner, although there were briefings, off-the-record briefings, that apparently he'd given him a stern telling off for having met with Hamas just the day before. But the fact that Jared came straight from Hamas to Israel doesn't make Netanyahu look good anyway. And Netanyahu has no real plan for what Israel is supposed to be doing in Gaza and for the border peace anyway. And the whole Likudiada, as it used to be known, it's a great story for him to run and run and run. And that's his power. Some of it is institutionalized power because, there are not a few media outlets that are extremely loyal to him. But it's also his power to get inside our heads.
Esther, that leads us perfectly into discussing your rather terrifying column this week. Netanyahu's plan to pulp the Middle East. Really, you want us to lose sleep, I'm sure.
I just want to say that it was terrifying. It was like scary reading. It was harrowing.
Yeah, so share your scary vision, Esther, with our listeners. You described the Prime Minister going into what you called campaign overdrive, igniting conflict when he can, and, quote, flooding the zone to inundate, confuse, and exhaust the opposition. And just to add to it, you say that his style reminds you of all things AI. So please lay out for us what he's doing.
Thank you very much for what you said about the column. Basically, it seemed to me, and still does, that Netanyahu has a kind of network of tactics and strategies, which is to basically ingest everything that is happening both in Israel and the region, the Middle East, in order to try and spit out votes for him. Now, what does this mean? It means that it could be anything from, his capacity to set the news agenda, but also it can also mean setting off fires around the Middle East, whether it's bombing Syria or bombing Gaza or bombing South Lebanon, which all happened in the space of basically 24 hours. Last week, where even an incredibly sympathetic US administration said, we can see that this is electioneering, you've got to calm down. But the point is that he has the capacity to aggravate or provoke or exploit any number of crises that are happening in this region, also including the West Bank and what is going there in terms of settler terrorism as well. And it's all funneled into this kind of enormous campaign mouth of a machine that is supposed to pull back votes for him from various camps that he has alienated. And that's why I made the comparison to AI, because there was an article in the Washington Post and in various other outlets as well about this process by which AI chatbots are being fed millions of secondhand books, which are basically dismembered in order to scan them and feed them into this galactic brain in order to spit out the more educated answers to a bigger data set for AI. And that's the analogy that I couldn't get out of my head.
Dahlia, do you think it'll work?
I mean, I still think it's too early to say, partly because of how we opened this podcast, right? There are so many little wild cards. And even if none of those parties that we talked about in the beginning cross the threshold, they could very easily drain away 6 or 7% of the electorate, which could lead to, 8, 9, or 10 seats being lost. So it does muddy the waters about the blocks. The blocks as it is, nobody's really getting a majority. And so far, I think that the logic of Esther's column, which really was excellent, is that he's desperate and he's firing in all directions. That's my metaphor. Firing in all directions, see what sticks, throw everything at the wall.
But also the more scared we are, the more we want Big Daddy, I find, both with Trump and with Netanyahu. The more things are scary and bad and chaotic.
I think it depends what you're scared of, right? Because a lot of people in this country, the majority of people in this country are scared of Netanyahu. So sure, yes. And that's why those who are scared are going for Eisenkot, not because Eisenkot has anything like a coherent program or vision that you can tell.
But they're also very tired of war. So it may be that Netanyahu is going back to his old favourites of, let's try and create a national security emergency. That is very, very hard for opposition parties to deal with. But on the other hand, Israelis don't want to be mobilized again into a war. This is already basically almost, more than 2/3 of his entire tenure as prime minister in this last round.
I know, but I think I would be cautious about assuming that Israelis don't want more war, because every individual doesn't seem to want any more. Everybody's sick of having their family lives overtaken by people in reserve duty for hundreds of days. And the consequences are just, the ripple effects are endless. And so I agree with you that we hear and see and feel that all around us. But I also think that every time we ask in a survey, not we, but anybody who asks, do you think Israel should escalate or not escalate on any of the various fronts, we have usually a significant minority, but sometimes over half, who say, no, we should escalate, because they still think the job hasn't been done. And so you have to reconcile the fact that those are some big trends alongside what could be the very same people who are exhausted and want to go home. It's no contradiction. The other thing, just to throw a few numbers at the issue, I'm keeping a much closer eye on the right-wing surveys now. And one thing I've noticed is that even in the right-wing advocacy polls, which is what I call them, but you could legitimately try to convey them the way the pollsters on the right convey them, which is that they think they have a more accurate picture of the electorate, and that's why they're more right-leaning. But either way, they are also showing an erosion of support for Netanyahu's bloc. And I just happened to look at the last survey and all the data that's posted to the Central Election Committee by our friend Shlomo Filber, who runs the polls for Channel 14, which is a very pro-Netanyahu channel. And if you add up the percentages of all the parties voting for parties of the current coalition, you get a magic number, 48.3%. Why is that important? That's exactly what they won last time. So on the one hand, that was a winning number. They got 64 out of 120 seats. On the other hand, it is no more, no less than they got in November 2020. And it's not a majority. In other words, it's true. Like the contradictions are there, which is why when you say, will it work? I don't know if it worked. Does that mean it worked? He can't get a majority, and yet he could still get a majority of the seats. The last thing I will say is that, I've said this many times, nothing has changed Netanyahu's general trends, either Likud or the coalition support, since about September, October 2024. His polling has been stuck come thick and thin. You can attack Iran and attack Iran again. You can bomb Lebanon. You can kill Hassan Nasrallah, and nothing has changed his polls. So when you say, can it work? If working means getting 48.3%, not even a majority, and getting 64 seats, then yes, it worked. But it's still not working to actually raise the level of support for him.
Well, if war is supposedly good for Netanyahu, you would think that a peace plan would be bad for him. But Dalia, you argue in your last column, in your most recent column, that in fact this Witkoff-Kushner project, which they just met with Netanyahu to push, that at first glance, them pressuring Netanyahu to implement the ceasefire that he never really wanted in the first place wouldn't be good for him, wouldn't be great for him. But again, your argument in the column is that in fact it might work in Netanyahu's favor politically. So how did you get to that conclusion?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just reading the readouts of what came out, and these were, as Esther pointed out, correctly that one of the things that looked bad for him was the fact that the Kushner team had met with Hamas, with Khalil Chaya, literally the day before, which is shocking, and then came to Netanyahu, and the fact that they're just dealing with Gaza and the ceasefire that he didn't want. You would think it looks bad. But the first reports that came out, which were all from unnamed sources and off-record briefings, were showing things that were really fundamentally different from the plan that was as it was actually published in October 2025. And mainly, this may sound like a technicality, but it's not, because the idea before was that there was supposed to be this phased conditional agreement, which I don't like personally because I think they always get stuck. But the phased conditional coordinated agreement was a quid pro quo. Hamas was going to do disarmament over time, coordinated with Israeli withdrawal in phases from Gaza. Again, not my favorite approach to negotiations and agreements, but that was what was in place. First items that came out about this meeting from the sources who are close enough to the right to know that they were briefed probably by Israelis, mostly by Israelis, I think, were that the sides agreed that there would be not only no withdrawal until disarmament is complete in one shot, but also no reconstruction of Gaza until disarmament is complete. Not started, not phases, not coordinated, not quid pro quo, just nothing until total disarmament. Total disarmament, to me, doesn't mean much. It's almost like total victory. How do you know when every single last weapon has been collected and destroyed, right? Up until now, we were talking about handing over weapons for storage, something that
Which
could
is
help
what they
Hamas
did in save Northern Ireland, right? What was it called? Repurposing or something about the...
There was some
the
language around it, yeah. But I mean, if that was what was being discussed before, and it was a way of kind of getting Hamas to agree with something that, of course, Hamas hasn't wanted to do, disarm, right? But now framing it in this absolute sort of total victory framework, basically to me says it will never happen. Like Israel could decide that disarmament has never been 100% completed and never even do any reconstruction in Gaza. I mean, and not only was that in the unnamed briefings, but eventually that particular line, no reconstruction of Gaza until disarmament is complete, eventually made its way into the government's official press release. And so you think, how are Gazans supposed to live in that situation? Basically, you're openly holding the civilian population hostage to Hamas's decision about whether to agree or disagree on something, that whether to support or oppose to something that basically turns the tables on the original agreement. I was a little surprised that it wasn't being conveyed by Netanyahu as more of a win. But I suppose the reality is that they ultimately just don't want the emphasis on the issue at all.
The real win is that he's not going to get more pressure and he's not going to be forced to do anything before the election.
Exactly. And apparently never, because how can you ever say every single weapon has been collected and destroyed?
I mean, never is good, but at least up until the election for Netanyahu right now is great. Esther, over the weekend, we had our opposition frontrunner, Gadi Eisenkot, declare on X that there is no Palestinian state, and under the government we established, there will be no Palestinian state. You've pointed out in the past that Eisenkot has been very careful, finessing most of these key yes or no issues up until now in order to build his support in the center rightish, the center leftish. So how was he pushed into making such a definitive statement on this issue?
Well, Eisenkot has said that he is willing to establish a government that is, in other words, supported from the inside or the outside by Arab parties, Arab majority parties. The leading contender for being a potential partner, and because it has already been part of an Israeli coalition, is the United Arab List, which is led by Mansour Abbas. And Mansour Abbas this weekend said at his own party conference that the state of Palestine already exists, and really why are we waiting for Israel and the US to recognize it? Now, he also said clearly, and has said all the way through, that he believes in a two-state solution, which is not particularly radical in our days, but he's basically saying there should be a two-state solution.
He also said we want to be at peace with that Palestinians. We want peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I mean, that was the main theme, I think.
Indeed. He was extremely, not just pragmatic, it just gave a very solid view of what used to be, certainly on the Israeli left and part of the centre, something that really wasn't particularly controversial at all. But we are in different days, a different period of time now, and the right wing basically took that as a potential attack line against Eisenkot. And Eisenkot decided on this issue not to keep his silence. He decided to get out there and say, basically, without explicitly commenting on this potential partner, Mansour Abbas, but he said, no, there will not be a Palestinian state on my watch, which, unfortunately echoes exactly what Netanyahu said a couple of days ago, and it's demoralizing for people who are interested in a different future for this part of the world. On the other hand, again, it is Eisenkot being a pragmatist. He knows that the soft right or centre right or the centre, all these voters are not enthusiastic. In fact, many are extremely antagonistic to any talk of Palestinian state, and that's why he did it.
Listening to that statement, to me, obviously I am representing a minority of the Israeli view with my personal political preference to reach a two-state solution. That pretty much characterizes the left in Israel and a portion of the center, but a minority at this point. So I realize that I'm not representative. However, it was so disappointing to see the person who is theoretically, hypothetically leading the charge in terms of trying to present an alternative vision for the country to Netanyahu, completely cave in, just totally succumb to the terms of the debate set by Netanyahu, which you pointed out before, sort of shamelessly, right? Because up until now, he had done a pretty good job of communicating, conveying that it might be okay to have Ra'am in the coalition by his own kind of creative code, which was like saying, well, we can have a party that accepts, a Jewish and democratic state of Israel, that accepts the Declaration of Independence, and that supports national service. That became a very clever code for basically saying we could, go into a coalition with Ra'am. Now, I thought if that's kind of his approach, finding ways to, as clearly as he can, but not explicitly, suggest that he's going to be really different from Netanyahu, I would have expected him to react differently on this critical issue. But no, it was just like, I can't possibly have the courage to actually set out any vision for what should happen with the Palestinians. And I have to just parrot what not only Netanyahu said a few days ago, but Netanyahu has been saying this since 2015. This is what Netanyahu has been saying, and his people have been saying year after year. And so now we know exactly what we're going to get from Gadi Eisenkot, which is more of the same.
Do you think theoretically he could have his cake and eat it too, in terms of making statements like this and positioning himself like this in order to get enough votes to form a coalition and have a party like Ra'am agree to go into a coalition with somebody who's saying there will never be a Palestinian state?
I honestly think Ra'am is less the problem than what his party actually intends to do if they get the leadership. And I don't think it's a given, right? They might not be leading the next government, but if they are, I think that, I can't say what Ra'am would do, but I still think that that's not going to be the deal breaker for Mansour Abbas, because it's never been. That was the bargain he made between him and his voters back in 2021 when he said, I'm joining this coalition. We're going to put the Palestinian issue to the side for now and work on issues of concern to Israelis, but he really meant focusing on issues that, are very urgent for the Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so I don't think that is really going to be the deal breaker. It's more like maybe Gadi Eisenkot took that position because he really believes it. Maybe he really does not believe there should ever be Palestinian self-determination via agreement with Israel.
Which we then ask, what does he think there should be?
Well, what does he think there should be with regards to anything? I mean, all I know is that he definitely supports a commission of inquiry over October 7th, which is what every opposition party supports. And, it's okay to run on these very, very specific little internal things, which I'm not saying it's a little thing. I do think it's critically important. But that's not a vision for the country. And what is his vision for the country? I mean, it's getting to be maddening, not having that kind of comprehensive long-term vision for what kind of country you want this to be. And then instead just parroting Netanyahu's lines.
Esther, speaking of Eisenkot, a few weeks ago, we discussed the fact that the Shabak, the Internal Security Service, had been asked, reportedly by many of Eisenkot's circle, to protect him because, he's the big threat to Netanyahu. He's the big threat to a potential continuation of this coalition. And there are many scary and dangerous people who might do anything that they could to prevent this from happening. And we learned over the past couple of days that the head of the Shabak, of the Internal Security Service, who's very Netanyahu friendly, has denied that protection. What do we think?
it raises somewhat the concern that Israel's internal security agency has been as thoroughly politicized as, for instance, its police force under Itamar Ben-Gvir, which has, ramifications far beyond whether Eisenkot is going to get a bodyguard or not, because the Shin Bet is responsible for the integrity of Israel's elections. So if there are obvious political reasons why the head of the Shin Bet, who, let us not forget, is an extremely right-wing figure whom Netanyahu once refused to promote because he was too messianic, meaning too crazily right-wing with kind of religious delusions as well. But he is now sitting at the head of the Shin Bet and making decisions about, we have no idea if there are concrete threats to Eisenkot's life. These kinds of things wouldn't generally be reported openly anyway. We have no idea whether he considered what was the incidents in front of him, or if he was taking his own decision, or perhaps was suggested that decision by people in government. We simply, there is no transparency because he is such a politicized figure, and the fact that Israel's somewhat powerful domestic intelligence agency is now under his thumb is a matter of wider concern than just the issue of Eisenkot.
Ladies, we always round off our election podcast with asking, what will you be looking for? What will you be looking at most intensively in the upcoming week? We are in the very, very dog days of summer, the last week of August, when many people are on vacation. Many people are just hot and tired. Many people are exhausted with entertaining their children who don't have school and don't have any kind of summer framework. But what do we think is next in terms of the political agenda and what will happen next in the campaign? What are you going to be watching for?
There are two things that I'm looking at. The first is the political fortunes of the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party Shas, which is a little bit wobbly at the moment. They seem to be bleeding votes, and partly that's because their Sephardi, traditionally religious base, many of whom serve in the army and are very, very angry by the whole draft to exempt ultra-Orthodox Jews from serving in the IDF. And they've started now a whole series of campaign videos to try and tug on the heartstrings, family sitting around on a Friday night dinner, trying to marry the idea that, yes, we know that you, our voters, are some of you are serving in the army, but on the other hand, trying to marry that with the idea of full-time Torah study as an alternative. It's not a very easy needle to thread, and I'm kind of interested in how they're going to work that out, also how they'll play it out in visual and campaign terms. And the other thing that I'm going to be looking at is to see if Israel is really interested in ramping up the war drums in regards to Turkey, because there's, on the one hand, Erdogan and Netanyahu have a long history of mutual, really, really crude insults that they love to fling at each other, and each side's domestic audiences lap that up each time. But let's just see if that's where it ends or something worse is going to happen.
Well, I could easily riff on both of those, but I'll just add on to the point about Shas that it occurred to me while you were talking that the spiritual leader of Shas I guess it was on Friday or Thursday, a video came out where he says there's no Palestinian nation, there's no Palestinian people. It's almost like everybody has to traffic in just completely denying the Palestinian cause, because everybody, center right and religious right seems to think that that is the way. I mean, I'm not sure he was doing it for campaign purposes. He probably truly believes it, but it's just remarkable how that, people say, oh, the Palestinian issue isn't even on the agenda. And I have argued years past, it's always on the agenda. It lurks there because everybody sees some value in trafficking in it one way or the other, usually from the right. I think the obvious thing that I'm going to be looking at is in a couple of weeks, the lists are about to close for the parties, and that's going to be when things get really serious. I will be obviously keeping my eyes on that because, one of the things about reading polls that probably, I don't think I put it in the piece, but honestly, everybody is having a great time looking at the sport of who's up, who's down, but we don't know anything really until the lists are final. Because how can the voters know who they're going to vote for when the parties don't even know who's running? And so once that is final, I think we will see the polls will, the trends are already there, but we'll see people taking their decisions much more seriously when they
the
respond
lists
to polls.
officially close and they have to file them on September 8th.
And so that's certainly a major thing that I'll be looking at. And I honestly also, just building on the troubles of Shas right now, they are down in most surveys to about 7 or 8 seats, even 7 in many of the surveys, which right now they have 11. So that's a big drop, if it's real. I will qualify it because Shas does tend to underreport in surveys, and I don't know how seriously all the pollsters out there are taking the issue of weighting, not just demographically, but for populations that have a long history of underreporting. So you never know. But I do think the issue of the draft really could be the final. I mean, I've put my finger on several issues over this phase so far, but I do think the issue of the ultra-Orthodox draft is really the best candidate to be something that either blocks former coalition voters who have defected from coming back and could even cause continued erosion, a little bit of bleeding from the coalition, because so many of the coalition's voters are religious, but that means national religious or Mizrahi religious, and those kinds of people are furious. Many of them. Can't generalize about everybody, but I will be keeping my eye on how much that issue becomes prominent between now and the elections. It's already prominent, but I think the question is, will it be used in a way that becomes the final push for some of these coalition voters?
Well, it's getting closer and closer, ladies. Not too many days, not too many weeks left before the elections, and that's with the Jewish high holidays in the middle, which often causes us to take a pause. Thank you so much, as usual, for joining me and sharing your insights, Dr. Dalia Shenlin, Esther Solomon, both amazing columnists for Haaretz, which should be read assiduously every week, multiple times a week. Thank you so much for joining
having us.
And that wraps things up for this edition of the Haaretz Election Podcast. Thanks again to my guests, Esther and Dalia. Thanks to my editor and producer, Adi Shacham. Don't forget, if you want to always listen to the podcast, never miss an episode, subscribe to us on YouTube or on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to get our podcasts. And if you're so inclined, leave a comment or give us a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to read Esther and Dalia's columns and keep up with all of the news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.